February 14th, 1944. 3:47 hours. RAF Wickenby, Lincolnshire. The briefing room smelled like stale cigarette smoke and fear. Lieutenant Harold Kemp sat in the third row, his fingers tracing the same crease in his navigation chart he'd folded and unfolded 17 times since midnight. Outside, frost crept across the runway. Inside, 42 crews, 294 men, listened to the intelligence officer describe their target, the marshalling yards at Augsburg, deep in southern Germany. The Flak map looked like someone had spilled ink across Bavaria. Black circles, dozens of them, each one representing 88mm guns that could shred a Lancaster bomber like paper. The route looked clean on the wall-sized chart, a neat red line threading between the worst concentrations. But Kemp stared at that map and felt something wrong in his gut. The kind of wrong that keeps you awake, the kind that gets people killed. He glanced at the other navigators. None of them seemed bothered. Maybe he was overthinking it again. Maybe his crew was right when they called him backwards Harry. But in 6 hours, 294 men would be over Germany. And Harry Kemp was about to make a decision that would either save them all or destroy his career before breakfast. The thing about Harry Kemp was that nobody expected him to amount to much. Born in Stockport in 1921, the son of a railway clerk and a seamstress, he'd spent his childhood watching the world from odd angles. While other boys played football, Harry lay on his back in parks, watching clouds move in reverse, imagining he was falling upward into the sky. His teachers called him distracted. His mother called him thoughtful. His father just called him late for dinner. He'd failed his first navigation course at training school. Not because he couldn't read a map. He could read one better than anyone. He'd failed because he insisted on reading them differently. Instead of plotting courses forward from departure to target, Harry worked backward. He'd start at the target and trace his way home, noting every landmark, every turning point, every danger zone in reverse order. "That's not how it's done," his instructor had said. "It's inefficient." But Harry couldn't help it. His brain just worked that way. When you read a map backward, you see things other people miss. They'd paired him with squadron leader James Preston's crew on a cold November morning in 1943. Preston was a stocky Yorkshireman with a handlebar mustache and zero tolerance for nonsense. Their first mission together had been a raid on Berlin. Harry had plotted the course his way, backward, and they'd arrived at the target 2 minutes early through a gap in the cloud cover nobody else had spotted. Preston had grunted his approval. "Don't care how you do it, Kemp, long as you get us home." That was 3 months and 11 missions ago. Now they were sitting in this briefing room, and Harry's backward brain was screaming at him that something was catastrophically wrong with today's route. The intelligence officer was still talking. "Expected fighter activity, moderate. Weather over target, clear. Time on target, it's 11:47 hours. Harry raised his hand. The room fell silent. You didn't interrupt the briefing. Not unless you had something important. "Sir," Harry said, his voice quieter than he'd intended. "The route. Has anyone checked what the Germans would expect us to fly?" The intelligence officer frowned. "We've plotted the safest corridor between known Flak concentrations, Lieutenant." "Right," Harry said. "But if I were running German air defense, I'd look at that route and know exactly where the RAF would fly. They've seen us avoid their flak fields for months. They know our patterns. What if they've moved guns?" The officer's frown deepened. "We have reconnaissance photos from yesterday morning. The flak positions haven't changed." "Photos from yesterday," Harry pressed. "They could move an 88 battery overnight. It's just trucks and tractors. What if they've created a corridor that looks safe but isn't?" The room erupted in muttering. Someone behind Harry laughed. A short, sharp sound. Preston turned in his seat and looked at his navigator with an expression Harry couldn't read. The intelligence officer's face had gone red. "Lieutenant Kemp, are you suggesting our reconnaissance is inadequate?" "No, sir," Harry said, though his hands were shaking now. "I'm suggesting the Germans aren't stupid. They know we study these photos. What if they're studying us studying them?" The wing commander stood up from the front row. Group Captain Morrison was a man who'd flown 47 missions and survived the kind of war that aged you in dog years. His voice cut through the noise. "Lieutenant, do you have evidence of new flak positions?" Harry swallowed. "No, sir. Just a feeling." The laughter was louder this time. Morrison's expression didn't change. "Gentlemen," he said slowly, "we don't plan missions on feelings. We plan them on intelligence. The route stands as briefed." He glanced at Harry, not unkindly, but firmly. "You're dismissed to your aircraft." Outside, the February air cut like glass. Harry walked toward their Lancaster, G for George, while his breath formed clouds. The rest of Preston's crew was already running pre-flight checks. Bomb aimer Tommy Walsh was a Londoner who'd survived the Blitz by hiding in tube stations. Wireless operator Peter Davies sang Welsh hymns when he was nervous. Flight engineer Bill Morrison, no relation to the group captain, could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. Rear gunner Jack Sullivan had frostbite scars on both hands from a night mission where the heating failed at 20,000 feet. And front gunner Scotty McLeod, barely 19, still wrote his mother every week and never mentioned how many times he'd nearly died. Preston was waiting by the aircraft's nose when Harry arrived. "You really think they've moved the guns?" Harry looked up at G for George. "Their Lancaster, their Fortress, their only chance of coming home. I think they'd be crazy not to." Preston lit a cigarette, cupping the match against the wind. "Morrison won't change the route, not without proof." "I know. But you're still sure." Harry pulled out his navigation chart and spread it across the aircraft's cold metal skin. "Look, every mission for the last month, we've threaded between these two flak fields. Nuremberg to the south, Munich to the southwest, the safe corridor. But that's the point. It's too safe, too obvious. If I were German intelligence, I'd watch our patterns and fill that gap with mobile flak units. Set a trap." Preston studied the map. "How would you fly it then? Your backward way?" Harry's pencil moved across the chart, not plotting forward, but tracing back from Augsburg. "I'd go the way nobody expects. See this area northwest of the target? Heavily defended on our maps. But those are fixed positions, permanent installations. The Germans would assume we'd never fly through there because it looks suicidal on paper. But fixed guns have fixed firing arcs. If we approached from this angle, came in low at this valley, we'd actually pass through the gaps between their coverage zones. The flak would be above us, around us, but not on us. For about 40 seconds, we'd be in a dead zone." 40 seconds, Preston said flatly. "That's not much margin. It's more than 0 seconds against mobile flak we didn't see coming." Preston took a long drag on his cigarette. The sky was lightening to the east. In an hour, they'd be airborne. In 6 hours, they'd be over Germany. "I can't authorize a route change," Preston said. "Only the wing commander can do that." "I know, but I can talk to the other squadron leaders, off the record, before we take off." Harry looked at his pilot. "They'll think I'm crazy." "They already think you're crazy, Harry. Backwards navigation, reading maps in reverse, working from the target back home." Preston ground out his cigarette under his boot. "But you've gotten us through 11 missions. Haven't been wrong yet." "There's a first. Time for everything." "Then let's make sure today isn't it." The next 45 minutes were chaos. Preston gathered 4 other squadron leaders near the control tower, while Harry spread his charts across the bonnet of a staff car. He showed them his backward route, the one that flew into the teeth of known defenses, but threaded through their blind spots. Flight Lieutenant Morgan from H Squadron called it suicide. Squadron Leader Davies from K Squadron said it was too risky. But Flight Lieutenant Barnes from M Squadron, a navigator himself before he'd moved to pilot, stared at Harry's charts and went very quiet. "Jesus Christ," Barnes whispered. "He's right. Look at the gun placements. They overlap everywhere except right there." He pointed at Harry's route. A gap, 30 seconds wide, maybe 40, if the timing's perfect and the altitude's exact. Morgan wasn't convinced. And if the timing's wrong, if we're 10 seconds early or late? Then we fly into concentrated fire from 3 directions, Barnes admitted. But if Kemp's correct, and they've moved mobile units into the safe corridor, we're flying into a meat grinder either way. At least this route has a chance. Preston looked at his watch. "We need a decision. We're wheels up in 30 minutes. "We need Morrison," Davies said. "This goes above squadron level." "Morrison already made his decision," Morgan countered. "The route is briefed. We follow the route, even if it kills 294 men." Harry hadn't meant to say it out loud. His voice came out harder than intended, sharp with fear disguised as anger. Morgan turned on him. "Listen, Lieutenant, you've got a theory, a guess, a backward map reading that might mean something or might mean nothing. Morrison's got reconnaissance photos and 3 years of operational data. Who do you think the RAF trusts more?" "I think," Harry said slowly, "that the Germans have 3 years of operational data too. They've watched us, learned our patterns, and they're not stupid." The argument might have continued, but at that moment, a staff car pulled up. Group Captain Morrison stepped out, his face set in lines that suggested he'd already had too long a morning. "Gentlemen, why are 4 squadron leaders and a lieutenant holding a conference by my vehicle at 0500 hours? Preston straightened to attention. "Sir, we need to discuss the route. The route has been discussed and briefed and finalized. Sir." Morrison held up one hand. "I understand Lieutenant Kemp has concerns. I understand he's a talented navigator with unorthodox methods. But we do not modify mission parameters based on intuition, not when 294 lives depend on precision." "Sir," Harry said, and his voice was steadier than he felt. "May I show you something?" Morrison's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Harry spread his backward plotted chart on the car bonnet. "The briefed route assumes static defenses. But sir, with respect, we've been flying predictable patterns. Look at our last 6 missions. All of them thread through this corridor between Nuremberg and Munich. The Germans have had time to study us. Mobile Flak units can redeploy overnight. They don't show up on yesterday's reconnaissance photos." Morrison studied the chart. The silence stretched. In the distance, engines were starting to warm up. The deep drumroll sound of Merlin engines that would carry them to Germany or to death. "You're proposing," Morrison said finally, "that we fly directly into a heavily defended zone that every reconnaissance photo shows as impassable." "I'm proposing we fly through the gaps in that zone, sir. Fixed defenses have blind spots. If we time it right, approach at this altitude, at this exact angle, we pass through their coverage in under a minute. Yes, it looks more dangerous, but it's actually safer because it's unexpected." "Or," Morgan interjected, "we crash directly into the defenses, exactly as they're charted." Morrison looked at Harry, really looked at him. "You're willing to stake your career on this, Lieutenant?" Harry thought about G for George, about Preston and Tommy and Peter and Bill and Jack and Scotty, about the other crews, men he knew, men he'd shared cigarettes with, men whose names he'd memorized because when someone doesn't come back, you want to remember their name. I'm willing to stake my life on it, sir, and so is my crew. But you're right, it's 294 lives, not just 7. If I'm wrong, I'll accept any consequence. But if I'm right and we fly the briefed route—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Morrison made his decision in the time it takes a heart to beat 3 times. "All right, here's what we'll do. I cannot, will not, change the mission route on intuition alone. But," he paused, "I can give squadron leaders discretion on their approach vectors once past the initial waypoint. If individual crews choose to deviate from the primary corridor for tactical reasons, that's within operational parameters." He looked at Preston, then Barnes, then Davies. "Gentlemen, you understand what I'm saying?" Preston understood immediately. "Yes, sir. Individual discretion on tactical routing." "Exactly. And if Lieutenant Kemp's alternate route happens to be shared with interested parties who wish to exercise that discretion, well..." Morrison's face remained completely neutral. "I can't stop professional airmen from discussing navigation theory." "And if we're wrong?" Morgan asked quietly. "If we all follow Kemp's route and fly into a massacre?" Morrison's expression hardened. "Then I'll take full responsibility. This decision comes from me. But Lieutenant Kemp," he turned to Harry, "if you're right, you'll save lives. If you're wrong, you'll have killed men with your confidence. That's the weight of command. Can you carry it?" Harry looked at the chart, at the backward route traced in pencil, at the gap in the defenses that might be salvation or suicide. His hands weren't shaking anymore. "Yes, sir." "Then brief any crews who want to listen. 10 minutes. After that, we follow standard procedures. This conversation never happened." Morrison climbed back into his staff car. Before he drove away, he leaned out the window. "Lieutenant, I knew your father. Railway clerk. Good man. He taught you to think differently, didn't he? To see patterns where others see chaos." Harry felt something catch in his throat. "He taught me that the obvious answer is sometimes the wrong answer, sir. Let's hope today isn't one of those times." The car pulled away. Within 5 minutes, word had spread across the airfield like wildfire. Backwards, Harry had an alternate route. Morrison had given tacit approval. Crews gathered around G for George, while Harry explained his navigation theory for the 4th time that morning. Some walked away. Morgan's H squadron stuck with the briefed route. But 31 crews, 31 Lancasters, 217 men, decided to trust the Navigator, who read maps backward. At 0622 hours, the first Lancaster lifted off into a sky, turning from gray to pale blue. Then another. Then another. Harry sat at his navigation table in G for George, surrounded by charts and instruments and the smell of metal and hydraulic fluid. Through the small window, he watched England disappear behind them. The Channel, the French coast, the long climb to 20,000 feet, where the air turned thin and cold, and every breath came from an oxygen mask. Tommy Walsh's voice crackled through the intercom. "How you feeling, Harry? Confident in that backward route?" Harry checked. His watch, his charts, his instruments. They were approaching the decision point, the moment when they'd commit to either the briefed corridor or his alternate route. "Ask me in 4 hours," he said. "If we're alive in 4 hours, I'll tell you." The formation split at waypoint Zulu. 11 Lancasters continued on the briefed route, threading between the known flak fields. 31 aircraft banked northwest, following Harry's backward navigation into what every map said was death. Preston's voice was calm on the intercom. "All crews, maintain formation. We're committed now. Navigator. Confirm heading. Harry's pencil moved across the chart. Heading 270, altitude 19,000 feet. Maintain speed. 4 minutes to the gap. 4 minutes. 240 seconds. Every second feeling like an hour. The sky around them was empty. No fighters yet. No flak yet. Just cold blue emptiness, and the drone of Merlin engines, and 217 men breathing oxygen and waiting. 3 minutes. Harry checked and rechecked his calculations. The angle had to be perfect. Too steep and they'd fly over the gap into the high-altitude guns. Too shallow, and they'd clip the low-level coverage. The margin was 40 seconds wide and measured in degrees of arc that left no room for error. 2 minutes. Peter Davies came over the intercom. Navigator, getting radio chatter. German, sounds like... They're confused. Something about unexpected traffic. Harry felt his pulse hammering. Confusion was good. Confusion meant they weren't expected. 1 minute. Visual on flak batteries, Scotty reported from the rear turret. Jesus, Harry, there's hundreds of them. Fixed positions, just like you said. We're flying between their coverage zones. Hold formation, Preston ordered. Hold altitude. Trust the route. 30 seconds. Harry could see it now through his small window. The massive fixed gun installations, their barrels elevated for high-altitude interception. But the Lancasters were threading the needle, approaching from an angle the guns weren't designed to cover, staying in that precious gap where mathematics and geography created a temporary sanctuary. 20 seconds. The flak started firing, but wild, confused. The German gunners had been expecting targets from the east, following the predictable corridor. These 31 bombers had appeared from the northwest like ghosts, already past the optimal intercept point, before anyone could react. 10 seconds. 5. Then they were through. Clear air ahead, the fixed defenses behind them. And as G for George leveled out for the bombing run on Augsburg, something came through on Peter's wireless. Garbled transmissions from the 11 Lancasters that had flown the briefed route. Panicked voices. Calls for help. The safe corridor had been anything but safe. Harry closed his eyes and didn't let himself feel anything yet. The bombing run lasted 7 minutes. Augsburg's marshalling yards erupted in geometric patterns of destruction. Railways twisted like wire. Warehouses collapsed into rubble. The organized precision of German logistics torn apart. But Harry wasn't thinking about the target. He was thinking about the 11 crews who'd flown the briefed route. The wireless traffic told a story written in blood and fire. Mobile flak units had indeed been moved into the safe corridor, exactly as Harry had feared, exactly as he'd predicted. The corridor had become a killing ground. Of the 11 Lancasters that flew the original route, 4 were shot down within 90 seconds. 3 more took catastrophic damage and would never make it home. The remaining 4 scattered, jettisoned their bombs early, and ran for Switzerland, or any piece of sky that wasn't filled with shrapnel. Preston's voice came through the intercom as they turned for home. All crews, Navigator Kemp's route brought us through clean. On my word, any crew in trouble can follow our heading home. We'll guide you back. They collected stragglers on the return flight, damaged bombers with dead engines, wounded crews, aircraft trailing smoke and barely holding altitude. The formation that had been 31 strong became 38 as they absorbed survivors from the massacre in the safe corridor. Not everyone made it. One of the damaged birds went down over France, another ditched in the channel, and a rescue boat managed to pull 3 men from the water before hypothermia took them. But 36 Lancasters crossed the English coast as the sun set over a country that had no idea what had happened in German airspace that afternoon. G for George touched down at Wickenby at 1847 hours. Harry climbed out of the aircraft on legs that felt like water. Group Captain Morrison was waiting on the hardstand, his face carved from stone. "Debrief, 1 hour, my office." Harry nodded. He couldn't speak. He walked to the debriefing hut where intelligence officers asked questions, and crews tried to explain what it feels like to be shot at by guns that weren't supposed to be there. The numbers came in slowly. Final tally. Of the 11 Lancasters that flew the original briefed route, only 4 returned. 7 aircraft lost. 49 men dead, missing or captured. Of the 31 aircraft that followed Harry's backward route, 28 returned intact. 2 damaged but repairable. 1 crashed on landing. Crew survived. Casualties. 4 men wounded, none killed. Morrison's office was exactly what you'd expect from a man who measured words like ammunition. Sparse, functional, no decoration except a photograph of his own crew from 1941. Half those men were dead now. Morrison gestured to a chair. Harry sat. "The route you plotted," Morrison began. "How did you know?" "I didn't know, sir. I guessed. But it wasn't random. I've been tracking our mission patterns for 3 months. We've become predictable. Anyone studying our routes could see the corridors we favor. And the Germans aren't idiots. They have navigation specialists, too. Someone on their side was thinking exactly what I was thinking, just from the opposite direction." "Opposite direction," Morrison repeated. "Your backward navigation method." "Yes, sir. When you plot forward, you optimize for what looks safe based on current intelligence. But when you plot backward from the target, you see the pattern of how you got there. You see your own predictability. And if you can see it, so can the enemy." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the sun had set completely. Night had come to Lincolnshire. "I'm putting you in for a commendation," Morrison said finally. "Distinguished Flying Cross minimum. You saved approximately 170 lives today. Maybe more." "Sir, don't." Morrison's voice wasn't unkind, but it was firm. "Don't tell me you were just doing your job. Don't tell me anyone could have seen it. They couldn't. 40 other navigators looked at those same maps and saw nothing wrong. You saw it because you think differently. That's not modesty to deny, Lieutenant. That's a skill to develop." He opened a folder on his desk. "I'm also assigning you to review all future mission routes before briefing. You'll work with intelligence. They'll give you reconnaissance photos 12 hours before anyone else sees them. Your job is to think like the enemy, to read our routes backward and find the traps." "Sir, I'm just a lieutenant. I can't." "You're the lieutenant who saved 42 bombers from a massacre. Yes, you can. And you will." Harry left Morrison's office as stars appeared over Wickenby. He found his crew at the pub in the village, a dark-beamed place called the Wheat Sheaf, where crews went to forget, to remember, to exist for a few hours as something other than men who bombed cities for a living. Preston bought him a pint. Tommy clapped him on the back hard enough to hurt. Peter started crying and couldn't stop. They didn't talk about the 11 Lancasters. They didn't talk about the 49 men who wouldn't be coming home. They just sat together in the warm dark and were grateful to be alive. Scotty raised his glass. "To backwards Harry, the navigator who saved our asses by thinking like a German." "To thinking backward," Walsh added. "May we all learn to see what's behind us before we fly into it." They drank. They sang Welsh hymns because Peter needed to hear them. They stumbled back to base at midnight and fell into their bunks and slept the dreamless sleep of men who'd looked at death and lived anyway. The story should have ended there. Navigator has insight, saves crews, gets medal, war goes on. But war doesn't write clean endings. 3 weeks later, Harry was reviewing photos for a Berlin raid when he spotted something. Mobile flak concentrations showing up in a new pattern. The Germans had learned their lesson too. They were adapting, creating false corridors, moving guns in unpredictable rotations, studying British responses the same way Harry was studying theirs. It became a chess match fought with reconnaissance photos and navigation charts. Harry would plot a route backward, anticipating where the Germans expected them to fly. German intelligence would predict British deviations and position guns accordingly. Harry would anticipate their anticipation and plot routes that exploited the gaps in their counter-predictions. And so on, in ever more complex layers of prediction and counter-prediction. Not every route Harry plotted worked. On March 11th, his backward navigation led a formation directly into a flak field that shouldn't have been there. Mobile units deployed in a pattern so counterintuitive that even Harry's reverse thinking hadn't caught it. 5 Lancasters went down, 35 men. Harry stopped sleeping well after that, started seeing the gaps in coverage as gaps where men would die if he miscalculated by even 30 seconds. The weight Morrison had warned him about became real, but he kept working, kept thinking backward, kept trying to save lives by seeing the war from the wrong direction. By May, intelligence officers across Bomber Command were using variations of his method. Reverse plotting became standard procedure. New navigators were trained to think like the enemy, to anticipate the anticipation, to see patterns in their own predictability. Harry's backward maps saved hundreds of crews, maybe thousands, before the war ended. The Distinguished Flying Cross came through in April. Harry accepted it in a brief ceremony at Wickenby, said thank you, and went back to his charts. He completed 47 missions total, more than double the standard tour of duty. His crew stayed with him through all of them. Preston, Tommy, Peter, Bill, Jack, Scotty. G for George brought them home every time, though by the end, the old Lancaster was more patches than original metal. When the war ended in May 1945, Harry was 24 years old and felt like he was 90. He'd saved countless men by thinking differently. He'd also sent men to their deaths when his predictions failed. That's the thing about being a navigator. You live with both. After the war, Harry went back to Stockport, married a woman named Elizabeth, who worked at the library, had 2 daughters. Never flew again. Never wanted to. But he kept maps in his study. Old navigation charts, flak maps, reconnaissance photos from 1944. Sometimes Elizabeth would find him there late at night, tracing routes backward from targets he'd bombed 30 years ago, still trying to see the gaps, still trying to find the way home. When people asked him about the war, he'd say he was a navigator. If they pressed for details, he'd tell them he read maps for Bomber Command. He never mentioned the 42 bombers, never mentioned the backwards method that became standard practice, never mentioned that his way of seeing the world differently had saved hundreds of lives. Squadron leader Preston, he made it to squadron leader by the war's end, wrote to Harry every Christmas until he died in 1983. Every letter said the same thing. Still here because of you, Harry. Never forget that. Tommy Walsh opened a pub in London, named it The Navigator. Peter Davies became a teacher, taught music to children in Cardiff. Bill Morrison fixed aircraft engines for British Airways. Jack Sullivan lost 3 fingers to frostbite, but lived to be 82. Scotty McLeod wrote a book about his war experiences, dedicated it to the Navigator, who saved us all by reading the map wrong. Except Harry hadn't read the map wrong. He'd read it exactly right, just from a different direction. In 1984, the RAF invited Harry to speak at a training ceremony for new navigators. He was 63, gray-haired, walked with a slight limp from an old injury that had nothing to do with the war. He stood in front of a room full of young men and women who would never fly Lancasters, who would navigate with GPS and computers, who would fight wars Harry couldn't imagine. "I'm going to tell you something about navigation," he said. Something they don't teach in the manual. The safest route is not always the obvious route. The best path is not always the one that looks easiest on the chart. Sometimes you have to think backward. Start where you want to end up and trace your way to where you are. And when you do that, you'll see things other people miss. You'll see the gaps, the spaces between the danger, the moments when being unconventional is the same thing as being alive. He paused. The room was completely silent. In February 1944, I read a map backward and saved some bombers from Flak they didn't know was waiting. People called it genius, called it inspiration. But it wasn't. It was just thinking differently, seeing the same information everyone else saw, but from a different angle. That's what I'm asking you to do. Don't just learn the procedures. Don't just follow the routes. Think. Question. Look at the mission from the target backward to the base. See what you're walking into before you walk into it. Because the enemy is smart. The enemy adapts. And if you don't think differently, you'll fly the predictable route. And predictable routes get people killed. He sat down. The room erupted in applause. Later, a young navigator asked him how he'd known the Flak was there, how he'd seen what the reconnaissance photos missed. Harry thought about that morning in February, the briefing room, the impossible decision, the weight of 294 lives resting on a backward map, and a feeling he couldn't prove. I didn't know, he said honestly. I guessed. But it was an educated guess, based on patterns, based on thinking like the enemy, based on understanding that war is a conversation. We move, they counter-move, we counter their counter. And if you can see that conversation from both directions at once, you'll find the gaps. What if you're wrong? The young navigator asked. What if your backward route is the trap? Harry smiled. Wasn't a happy smile. Then you carry that weight. Every day. For the rest of your life. But you make the call anyway. Because not deciding is also a decision. And sometimes, the unconventional choice is the only chance you have. Years later, in a nursing home in Cheshire, Harry Kemp would sit by the window and watch planes trace contrails across the sky. His daughters visited twice a week. His grandchildren called from university. Elizabeth had passed in 2001, and he'd carried her photo in his wallet ever since. The photo of G for George sat on his bedside table. 7 young men standing in front of their Lancaster, grinning at the camera like they'd live forever. Most of them had. Because of a navigator who thought backward. A railway clerk's son who'd failed his first training course. A man who'd learned to see patterns in chaos by lying on his back in parks, watching clouds move in reverse, imagining himself falling upward into endless sky. The contrail dissipated. The planes disappeared. Harry closed his eyes and saw maps traced in pencil, gaps in coverage, routes that led home. After a moment, he smiled. He'd made it home. They'd made it home. Maybe that was enough.